Hello, everybody, to our TILE seminar in February. Welcome to everyone, and particularly our speaker today, Dr. Jennifer Veilleux. She is an associate professor of psychological science at the University of Arkansas in the USA. She's a licensed clinical psychologist who received her PhD in clinical psychology at the University of Illinois at Chicago in 2011. Her research focuses on emotion regulation with an eye toward integrating social, personality, and clinical science to understand what prompts people to avoid their feelings or act out on their feelings, as well as how to best help people cope with their emotions. She teaches undergraduate and graduate courses on emotion and personality and has regularly taught statistics and research methods at the undergraduate level. At the graduate level, she supervises doctoral students learning to do psychotherapy and psychological assessments. In her personal life, Jen is married with 2 elementary school children, where she enjoys listening to musical theater and reading young adult fiction. I'm going to hand over to Jen. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. Welcome, Jen, and we're looking forward to your talk about managing difficult students.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much to all of you for being here. Going to do my own screen share. Okay, so we're talking about managing difficult students here, with difficult in quotes. So I'm Jen Veilleux, as was said earlier, in case anyone needs help with that. That means hey you with the V, Veilleux, hey you. That's how I tell my students how to pronounce my name. And as Carolina said, I am a researcher. My primary area is about how to tolerate distress around, it's emotion and emotion regulation, but distress tolerance is a major area. I teach right now a lot of personality courses, personality psychology assessment, as well as history of research methods and statistics. And I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, which matters for this talk because there's a lot in this talk that was borrowed from best practice principles in individual and couples therapy and working with people one-on-one. And because in the world of clinical work, I'm drawn towards complex, or what some people might call difficult cases, and working with people who can be challenging. And so those skills I've applied to this talk. So what we're going to talk about today is, what does it mean to be difficult? So trying to think about how we talk about challenging student situations. And I'm going to go through a 6-step process for navigating challenging student situations, which means I'm going to solve all issues you have with students in 1 hour, all of them. Okay, that's not true. I won't solve all of your problems, but I do hope that this set of steps gives you something to anchor yourself when working with students who can be challenging. And I'm hoping that there's time for questions or discussion. I'm trying to keep the Q&A up so that I can see your questions as they arise if you want to put them in the chat or the Q&A. So the first question is, what does it mean to be difficult, right? Anyone who teaches or really has to work with other people know that some interactions are harder than others. And what does it mean to have a difficult student? So we've all likely labeled a student as difficult, and that might be understandable, right? There are some students that are harder to work with, harder to reach, harder to get through to, harder to talk with. And some of these students realistically make our lives more difficult and more time consuming. But labeling a student as difficult is problematic, okay? In part because it relies on heuristics, right? When we label a student as difficult, we are giving them that word, and it is hard to detach from seeing a student as anything but difficult, even though people are messy, variable creatures who, even when they engage in behaviors that are problematic, probably aren't all the time. So this is kind of an identity-based instead of person-first language. So instead of a person who has difficult or challenging behaviors, calling a student difficult just slaps that label on them, which is stigmatizing. Maybe not to their face if you're not calling them that to their face, but even when we're talking about students with our colleagues, or we're thinking about them and we're sort of pigeonholing a student as difficult, it's hard to think about them as anything else. And that makes working with the student and problem solving much harder. So what it's doing is essentially assigning them difficult as a personality trait, which is not an actual personality trait. And labeling a person as difficult just colors the lens through which you view them. So it means that you often may ignore the positive things. It also involves underestimating the relevance of context. Many times when students are engaging in challenging behavior, problematic behavior, there's a reason. And so there's contextual factors that underlie what it is that they're doing. Remember, for those of you who are in psychology, and if not, you may have still heard of the fundamental attribution error, where we tend to see some of the contextual features of our own behavior, right? When we cut someone off in traffic, we didn't mean to do it. It was an accident. You know, we just had to get across, but when someone else does it, they're a jerk, right? We tend to label people based on their behavior rather than seeing all of the features that go into behavior, of which context and randomness and luck are some of those features. Also, labeling a student as difficult possibly underestimates your role. Now, maybe you all in this chat today are perfect, in which so congratulations, please share your skills with me, but I'm not perfect. And so sometimes when a student is challenging, it is not as much because of them, but they are hitting one of my own trigger buttons. And so they wouldn't be as challenging for someone else. And so labeling a student as difficult is a diffusion of responsibility and underestimates your own role. It also possibly underestimates systemic factors, you know, students who may not have stable housing, who maybe have a documented disability, who may be racial or ethnic minority, who might be trying to come out as you know, gay or as non-binary. There might be lots of things that are going on for that person, and labeling them as difficult also doesn't give them the systemic context that they deserve. So instead, I want to try to reframe that. Instead of talking about difficult students, what we're really talking about here is finding ways to manage challenging student situations, right? This emphasizes the situation over labeling the person. It also acknowledges the fact that there are some student situations that are legit challenging and difficult for you. It also gives more room for understanding why the situation feels tricky, and reframing a situation as challenging adopts more of a growth mindset of a hurdle to overcome rather than a kind of problem that has no solution. It is also true that some students are inherently more obnoxious than others to you, right? There's a personality match thing that happens. But it's true that the way that we talk matters for how we think. So when we talk about people in this labeled, stereotyped way, then that not only reflects what we think, but embeds those concepts in how we think. And so these situations require careful thought and processing to be able to handle well. So I'm going to talk about a 6-step framework today for navigating these challenging situations. And here's the overview, right? I'll go through each piece. So we want to identify specific behaviors, think through the repercussions of the behavior, think about underlying explanations, document, consult, and then take action. So I think sometimes we jump to consulting / venting or complaining, or maybe talk to the student in a kind of, you need to not do this sort of way without maybe thinking through all these pieces. So after I go through the steps, I'll sort of explain where these steps came from. They have some science base in them, as well as based in kind of best practices in psychotherapy. And I hope that they will be useful to you. So the first step is to identify the specific behaviors that a student is doing that you deem problematic. Okay? Now, I did an unscientific qualitative survey on Facebook where I asked a bunch of academic friends of mine who are in teaching and kind of mentoring roles what kinds of things they find annoying or challenging to deal with. And so this is very unscientific, but seemed very representative of my experience. So one thing that is not great is when students don't do the work, right? They know when things are due and they just don't do things, okay? That could also involve not coming to class. The opposite problem of kind of disengaging is students who are engaged, but in a way that is disruptive. So that could involve students making biased statements or gestures that are racist, gendered, any sort of ism that you might think of. Some students aren't saying things that are inherently kind of problematic to a group of people, but over talk, right? When I was a early faculty member, I used to call it the that guy phenomena, where there's somebody who would sort of always be inserting their opinion and perspective. This person often sits in the front, can't see the facial expressions of the people behind them, and kind of inserts themselves into all of the conversation. You can also see people providing a lot of personal anecdotes over evidence, sort of saying, well, that can't be true because I, right? And so all of these things can be disruptive to the class environment. Another type of behavior that students engage in is nitpicking. So this is this wheedling for extra points or grade grubbing or complaining that they got a 96 and should have gotten a 99, kind of like needing lots of like little details and taking a lot of your time kind of trying to get all these extra points, often at the end of the semester when they haven't done previous work. And then, of course, we have the kind of big ones around cheating and plagiarism, which, like making racist comments, are kind of unequivocally bad. So there could be others, of course, but these are the big ones that came up in my unscientific poll and ones that I have encountered in my teaching career too. So regardless of what the behavior is, the first step is to specifically describe the behavior without judgment. Now, rest assured, that judgment is important to acknowledge your kind of attitudes and irritations with the student behavior. So don't worry, we'll get to that, but it doesn't belong in this first step. So what I mean by specific is we want specific and without judgment. So example of an unspecific statement is Tina talks too much. Well, that's unspecific because it doesn't articulate any kind of benchmark. What is too much? It's hard to know what that actually means, and it's hard to give feedback on that when it doesn't clarify what enough is or where the line is between okay and too much. So we might refine that by saying Tina frequently, at least once per class, which suggests maybe more than desired, tells a story which are usually only tangentially related to class content. You know, you might add something that these stories often take, 10 minutes, which is a substantial portion of a 50-minute course, and, takes away time from lecture. You could add something specific, additional specificity. It is also the case that we want to try to avoid judgment. So an example of a judgmental comment is Kevin rudely saunters into class 10 minutes late and then interrupts the conversation and asks dumb questions that were already answered, which he would know if he were on time, right? This is how I would talk to a friend. A reframe of that is last week on Wednesday, Kevin came to class 10 minutes late and then loudly asked two classmates questions about the assignment that were answered in the first 5 minutes of class. So we want to kind of specifically articulate the when, the context of what happened, and trying to remove the, rudely dumb, those kinds of comments. Now, when dealing with challenging student situations, this is often not an isolated incident, right? There may be multiple behaviors. Kevin may do this. Kevin and Tina are example people, might be doing this a lot. And so we want to think about documenting. We'll talk a little more about documentation in a little bit, but frequency is important to note because a lot of times what you're wanting to do is to establish patterns. So many of us can tolerate, a student coming late to class or a student telling a story on one day, but when they do it repeatedly, that is when the threshold reaches challenging or problematic. So we want to be able to kind of identify specificity and think about what the benchmarks are that you're looking for, and we'll get back to that in a second too. We also may want to identify lack of desired behaviors. So this is harder, but also possible to articulate. So sometimes students are doing things that you expect of them, or not doing things. So I currently have a student who has not come to class in 2 weeks. She's turning materials in, but is not coming to class. And they have an assignment due every single day, and there's no textbook. So when there's things that are happening in class, like all the course content, she's not getting any of it. So that missing class is a lack of behavior that I wish she was doing. Okay. So think about this here. As we walk through these steps, you might want to be thinking of a particular example of a student behavior that you have encountered to kind of track along and sort of see what, if you can kind of apply these steps to a particular student situation. So think about someone who you are dealing with now or you have dealt with of late, and see if you can kind of specifically note some of the behaviors that are problematic. Okay, so the second step is thinking about the repercussions of that behavior on the multiple stakeholders here. So you'll first want to think about what effect these behaviors have on you, and then think about the behaviors, the effect of these on the student, and then think a little more broadly about how these behaviors affect other people and other potential stakeholders, classmates, other faculty, department chair, the dean, if things are getting escalated. So let's talk through these pieces. So this is the part of the steps where you get to be honest and recognize your judgments about this student and this situation. So this is a place where you also want to be specific. So you want to think about how this behavior affects you personally, right? So you might be emotional in response to this student. You might be angry or irritable with them. Is that emotion coming from the student itself, that encounter, or is that emotion you sort of feeling frustrated or overwhelmed for not knowing what to do? Are you scared of confrontation because you know you need to talk to the student and you don't know how to do it? There's lots of reasons why this behavior might affect you personally, right? I know that when I'm being honest with myself, when people don't come to class, like my current situation, I don't want to take it personally, but I do. I feel like they are avoiding class because they don't like me, or they don't like my class or the way that it's set up, even though realistically, that probably has nothing to do with it. But that's part of it, is sort of I have to sort of sift through that I don't like this for myself because it feels like they're avoiding me, and who likes that? Okay, so other ways in which behaviors of students can affect us as professors, as teachers, are feeling helpless. So sometimes a student is clearly struggling and you want to help them, but you don't know how. So it feels like a helpless situation. You might feel resentful. So this tends to happen less with the students that are ghosting you, like not around, but more with the ones who are taking up excessive time, either nitpicking or causing behavioral disruptions. And so you might be resentful that this is time taken where you have to manage your emotions, which as an emotion regulation researcher, I can tell you, like, that takes effort and energy, which we don't always have as faculty. A student might be kind of taking up time that you are not then devoting to other students because they're taking up, like, coming to office hours or calling you all the time or sending 100 emails. And then you have to figure out how to respond to them. And so there may be a huge time commitment piece here that results in you feeling resentful towards the student. Now, once you've sifted through the sort of repercussions of this behavior for you personally, then you want to pivot and start thinking about why these behaviors are problematic for the student. This is helpful to think through because eventually, probably, you're going to talk to the student. And so you want to sort of think about where these behaviors, if we know that people do things, that people engage in behaviors and then they continue to engage in the same behaviors. So if we think about there's a strategy in self-regulation research where you're trying to change your behavior, you sort of think, well, what if I always make this decision? And when you think that, then you often make a different decision. And so we have to think about, what if the student continued to make these same decisions, engage in these same behaviors with other faculty members, in other classes, and in a job later on down the line, right? One of the things that being a clinical psychology faculty member where I train graduate students to do therapy is we discuss how that kind of role is a gatekeeping role, right? It is my job to make sure that the graduate students are competent in therapy and assessment. And if we pass them through and they continue to engage in these behaviors, it's going to be problematic for them and for the public who they might be treating and not treating well. The same general principles can apply to talking about students of all levels, including undergraduates. So if the behaviors continue now, there are some course-related actions. The student may fail the course. They may not be able to pass the exams. Those things might happen now. If they engage in these behaviors, they may delay graduation, right? If they have to overcome kind of plagiarism and retake a course, they may not be able to graduate on time. If the behavior is mental health related, this also may influence life. So a lot of times, we'll talk about this more in a little bit, anxious students do not attend class or participate in class. I actually just encountered this last week. I had a student who was not coming to class, different one. And I emailed the student and said, I'm concerned about you not coming to class, like you're not getting the material and you're probably not going to pass the exam if this continues. And he actually came to class. He's come to class every day since and came up to me afterward and said, I'm just really anxious and my anxiety has kept me away from class. And because I'm teaching a class on emotion, I said, coming to class might actually help you learn some things about your anxiety that might help you. And he was like, I think maybe you're right. Not everyone who doesn't teach about emotion has that hook to get people in, but anxiety tends to pull people away, and that isn't really typically how someone wants to live their life in the grand scheme of things. It is also the case that the behaviors that they're engaging in now may continue in a work environment, right? If someone's being disruptive in class, saying those things is going to get them into trouble in a job setting. So part of what we're trying to do here is to be able to give the students some feedback in a way that can help them improve themselves so that they are more successful, whether in this class now, in a class next semester, or in a job down the line. So we also want to think about this because we want to think about who might be other people who are affected, right? So it could be that when a student's disruptive in class, the repercussions are for other students, right? I had a student once who said whatever came to mind in class, and the other students were rolling their eyes at her, and she didn't notice that other people were having a negative reaction to her, and so she kind of kept doing it, but it was clearly irritating the rest of the students in class because it felt disruptive. So other people may be stakeholders here too, the rest of the class. And so acknowledging the repercussions allows you to kind of think about, label, articulate your own emotions, which we know from an emotion regulation research perspective is helpful to kind of reflect and label. This process also helps you separate your feelings from their actions. So a lot of times when people talk, this is a classic couples therapy technique where people say, you know, like, you made me irritated. And it's like, we want to try to pivot that around and people owning their emotions in response to a behavior rather than the assumption that the behavior directly causes the emotions. So when the student does this, I feel sad, or I feel irritated, or I feel worried, is different than the students making me feel that way. And engaging in this step allows you to sort of separate out those pieces. Okay, so think about this as you think about the situation that you are sifting through here, right? What were the repercussions were or are on you, perhaps on the student, and perhaps on other people, which could involve other class members, could also involve other faculty members, could involve the board who's responsible for plagiarism checking, other folks as well. Now, number 3 is about brainstorming underlying explanations. So this is about asking yourself, why might the situation be happening? Now, the idea here is not to land on the reason, because typically multiple reasons are at play, but to come up with several possible reasons why these behaviors are happening. And the idea is to generate ideas, not to, at this point, check them out at all. So this means thinking beyond that trait or person level explanation, right? Because the student is an a-hole is not typically a good reason. Underlying behavior, traits don't cause behavior, they reflect behavior. So this step's actually using an emotion regulation skill called cognitive reappraisal, where people try to think about a situation from a different lens. So we're building here on emotion regulation strategies to generate ideas. Now, let's go through a couple of reasons why student problem behaviors can happen. And there's many more that I'm going to go through here, but these are a couple of big ones. One is that a student may lack knowledge about their expectations or desired behaviors. Now, some students don't read the syllabus and don't have any idea what's in the syllabus, and your expectations are laid out clearly and they haven't read it. That is on them. But it is also the case that sometimes you have expectations of your students that you think everyone has, but they don't, right? So what are your implicit expectations about your students and about how classes are supposed to work? So what do I mean by that? So are you someone who expects conversation or discussion in class? Is that what makes you happy? You like it when people talk? Or would you prefer to just have the stage the whole time and have people take notes and not interrupt? There's some fields like philosophy where having arguments or confrontations is actually a part of the field. I know in psychology, it is not typically part of ours. So when people go to philosophy talks and sort of see people kind of sort of getting in each other's face and yelling at each other a little bit, it's like, what's happening? Are they angry? No, it's just part of the field of what happens. So how are students supposed to treat each other in class? Is it okay with you if students kind of throw barbs at each other, or do you want a particular type of respect? What are your expectations for their interactions with you? Like, do you want students to email you at 1 a.m.? And will you respond over the weekend, right? I do. I mean, I don't really want them to email me at 1 a.m. and they know I'm not going to respond because I'm asleep, but I have no problem responding to emails over the weekend. I would rather hear from a student than not hear from a student. I'm on my email all the time anyway. I have no problem replying to students on the weekends. I have friends who prefer to keep the weekends for themselves and they will operate on a more business model. I will respond to emails at 8 a.m. on Monday when I'm back in the office. There's no right or wrong here. You just need to be upfront with yourself and then with your students about your expectations. So do you want people to come to office hours, right? I call my office hours student hours because I want students to show up. I mean, they don't, but I want them to, right? Do students know what to call you, right? I want students to call me doctor or professor and not Mrs., and I have very clear reasons about that. And so you have to think through kind of what your explicit expectations are, and then which ones are maybe have gone unsaid. Like someone said in the chat, the hidden curriculum. These are things that particularly first generation college students, they do not know. Now, once you've been clear about this, you can prevent some problem behavior by including this information up front in a syllabus or having initial class discussions about what is expected in the class environment. I know for myself, I give a syllabus quiz that's due on the first day of class that counts as an assignment that I can make it very clear many of these things, and I know that they've read it because they've had to take a quiz about it. So that has gotten some of these problems has been fixed by being very clear and then forcing the students through a quiz to encounter this material. A lot of the reason why students have behavioral problems stems from mental health struggles. So anxiety is the emotion most associated with perfectionism, and nitpicking is about perfectionism and anxiety. When students are disengaged, there's often depression or anxiety related thereto. I just had a student email me yesterday saying that she didn't turn in the paper because she was trying to navigate changing medications for her anxiety and depression. And she was a mess for a week and just didn't do anything. So sometimes people who are struggling with mental health know that that's what's going on, and other times they don't. So sometimes students who are anxious assume that no one's that way. Sometimes students who are neurodiverse, who may kind of not, particularly those with like autism spectrum disorders, who may not kind of have the same sort of social awareness as neurotypical folks, don't kind of recognize when they've crossed a social norm boundary, like talking too much in class, and don't realize that they're affecting other people. Beyond mental health struggles, there is so much going on with students that we don't know, right? Students have family issues. Maybe their parents are getting divorced. Some students work multiple jobs. Some students are dealing with relationship stressors like breakups, or even, even spending a lot of time getting into a new relationship can be an emotional struggle, even when it's fun. People have physical health struggles, including pregnancy, dealing with fertility, other kinds of physical problems, diseases, disorders. Folks who are from minority backgrounds. I mean, I'm talking, I think, from a U.S. standpoint here, where people, white supremacy runs the U.S. And people of color and people who are LGBTQ status, just from living in this environment, may experience minority stress that may look different in different countries, but it certainly can be a player for some students. It is also the case that everyone handles life struggles differently, right? Some students, when they encounter struggles, double down and try to work harder, and in doing so, neglect some aspects of their mental health, and some lash out. They feel like the world is unfair and put that out on others, and other people kind of shut down and freeze and can't move. There's a fight, flight, freeze response a little more generally that's kind of going on here. And then there's a lot of individual differences in how people handle these life struggles. But a lot of students think that they're supposed to be able to handle these things and that they're not really supposed to be affected by them, and that they shouldn't even tell us when these things are going on. It's also important to recognize that one reason why students may be acting the way that they do is they have different values than you. So research shows that we tend to interpret other people's behavior through our own tendencies, looking at our own behavior as sort of a benchmark for what other people are supposed to do. And yet, not all students value what we do or did, right? You know, I've always loved class. I love education. I hated missing school because I hated missing learning. I wanted to get good grades. That mattered to me and it mattered to my family. That is not the case for all students. Not all students value education. Some students might be in college because they were told to, or because it's a good opportunity to like meet other people and party. And they're not really thinking very far ahead in the future about what their education means to them, or even that it matters to what they're going to do at all. Now, I want to be clear that from my perspective, any kind of biased statements is not acceptable, acting, racist, classist, any of that. It is also the case that a lot of these belief systems and the way that people act are learned by seeing how your family responds to people who are different, seeing how kind of people in your cultural environment react to people who are different. And so students come from different value systems, from learning environments, and from cultural expectations, right? I had a student last week talk about how in her family's immigrants from India, and that, she was expected to do her work and like not show emotion and not complain about things, and that she was shocked that that was not the case with her friends and the way that the US operates, how adolescents operate in the US. And so the value systems that we come from influence our actions and our behaviors. And so we want to cut down kind of racist and disrespectful behavior, but it can come from a place of ignorance rather than a place of maliciousness. So, for example, we know from research that political conservatives tend to value loyalty, authority, and tradition and purity, whereas people who are more politically liberal tend to value kind of harm reduction and fairness. And so where families come from tends to be, the values tend to be embedded in the family system and in the cultural context. So college is about broadening minds, enhancing critical thinking, and teaching respect. But that doesn't mean that people come in this way, and it's important for us as faculty to remember that. So the point here is that we can correct the behavior without assuming that the student has malintent. Some students just lack necessary skills, right, to be good students, right? So some people don't know how to be assertive, they don't have study skills, they don't know how to exert self-control, they've procrastinated, they don't know how to overcome that. There are lots of things that students might lack. So step 3 is all about kind of thinking through what might be some reasons, and any one of these could be a reason. So you can use all of these as potential ways to think through what might be going on for the student. So these first 3 steps are really thinking steps, right? So you kind of need to sift through, like, what is the problem? How is it affecting the people that it's affecting? And then what might be going on behind it? Once we get through these steps, now we're in more of the action phase of this plan. So write down the specific behaviors, repercussions, and explanations, the steps that we went through, so that you kind of have everything at the ready, right? We often, maybe I'm speaking for myself here, but I know that when I'm thinking things through, I often think to myself, well, I'll remember this later, but then I don't, because we don't remember all the things that go through our heads. And so we want to be able to write down the specific behaviors, both from a kind of covering yourself legally standpoint, and also just to be clear, because when you do talk to the student, you want to be clear about the behaviors from this specific non-judgmental frame, so that you can articulate what are the expected behaviors. So write everything down. Okay, then it's useful to consult. So I find this step valuable for a couple of reasons. One is that talking to a trusted colleague can give you some perspective and some feedback. Now, when picking which colleague you want to talk to, I would recommend picking someone who's able to give constructive feedback, not just someone who will ruminate with you. So I'm actually writing a book on kind of emotional health for the general public. Kind of what do we need to know about the science of emotion and emotion regulation to be able to be more emotionally healthy. And I've been looking at research on emotional expression. And there's some pretty good evidence that people seek out those who will be kind of supportive and just agree with us, but that tends not to lead to the best outcomes. The best outcomes come from when we can share and feel heard and understood, and the person who we share with gives us some perspective and a little bit of sort of gentle pushback. Because part of what we need to know from this conversation is like, is this me, right? Am I having a reaction to the student because of my own stuff? Or is this something that reaches, like, would you be mad about this too? Would you be upset about this? And if the person says no, it doesn't mean that your experience is wrong. I want to be crystal clear about that. Your feelings and your reactions are valid no matter what they are, but it can help you recognize whether this is sort of you bringing your past into this emotional experience, which we call muddy emotions in the therapy world, or if this is sort of a pretty clear the student is engaging in a way that would be upsetting to a lot of other people, because whether it is you or kind of everyone would suggest that maybe the actions taken need to be a little bit different. So when you talk to this person, kind of talk about your documented notes, maybe share with them the steps that you're going through, and so that you can get some perspective. You know, does your colleague have other repercussions you haven't thought about? Does this colleague have ideas about what might be going on for the student that you haven't thought of? So give yourself opportunities to ask questions and kind of expand your thinking a little bit while getting some support. Now, we've gone through these 5 steps, and the last step after doing all of these things is taking action. Now, that may be talking to the student, and oftentimes it should be, I think. So being direct and having clear communication with students is an important skill. Giving feedback is an important skill that many of us didn't learn, but can be learned. It's a skill. It may be the case that taking action requires escalation or elevation and talking to someone else, but talking to the student is often an important step, right? But maybe you don't need to talk to the student because maybe it's you, right? So again, you're allowed to have your own reactions, but sometimes when students have problem behaviors like this is something you need to reflect on and wrestle with. So is it a problem for me right now that my student isn't coming to class? Yes, it's a problem for the student because they're not getting the material. But the problem of me kind of feeling, you know, like they're maybe like avoiding me a little bit or don't like me, that part's a me part. And so I need to kind of process that part and deal with that, because that doesn't need to come into the conversation. That's something that I need to sort of sift through on my own. In doing this, you want to think about your limits. So how much time are you wanting to put into the situation? What is necessary? What is the outcome that you're looking for? So think about a goal here and try to articulate a clear goal. Do you need to escalate the situation to a chair or a dean or a plagiarism committee or something else? Is this something where you think bringing in an additional person will be necessary, or if not necessary, valuable to you? If that is the case, step 4 of documentation will be your friend, because you will be specific and non-judgmental and kind of have a list of things that have happened, potentially with dates, where you can go to that higher escalation person and kind of have all of your ducks in a row. But if you want to talk to the student, think about how to talk to the student. So the first thing is to consider it a conversation and not a confrontation. That piece matters because when we think of conversations as confrontations that you have to kind of tell someone that they did something wrong, that is when anxiety tends to get higher for a lot of people. Confrontation is something many people, not most, I shouldn't say that, I don't know. Many people don't like. It feels uncomfortable to confront others. And there are certainly some cultural and gendered pieces to confrontation too. So consider it a conversation. So documentation here can help too, because when people are nervous, communicating clearly is difficult. It's hard to think when anxiety is high. And so having your thoughts written down means you don't have to think, you just have to read. So here's a possible script for talking to a student, okay? Your behavior of this, whatever they did, is problematic. It is problematic for me because there's a repercussion for me. It may be problematic for you because you aren't hearing the material in class. This may be an issue for you in your career later on down the line. But this piece at the end is important. I'd like to understand what is happening with you so that we can figure out best how to proceed, right? The interest in understanding and wanting to know what's going on with the person and trying to have curiosity about the situation rather than like, this is a problem, don't do it, which is much more authoritarian. And you want to approach the situation with assertiveness, but also with curiosity. Then ask questions. So, what is happening? What is going on with you? Is there something going on with you at home? Is there something going on with you outside? It's important, I think, to say that you don't have to talk about stuff. You don't want to force the student to tell you anything that they're uncomfortable telling you. But in my experience, most students want to, are willing to share if they know that someone's going to listen. So have a conversation with the student, okay? When you've thought through all the repercussions and you've thought through kind of what might be going on, it's most likely one of those things, or it's something that you haven't thought about at all. But when there's a conversation and the student feels cared for and understood, they're going to be more motivated to change their behavior. Now, I want to make a slight revision here, which is if the situation is immediately harmful to someone. For example, if someone says something racist or makes a like rude gesture to someone else in class, it is our job as faculty to take immediate action to protect the person being harmed. So doing steps 1, being specific and taking action immediately, maybe without all of the mental processing, maybe do that later, but it is our obligation to kind of step in, identify a problem behavior and try to fix it. When you have time to think about how to respond, then follow the full 6-step framework. It is also relevant to take preventative measures here, right? If you can articulate your expectations and provide them up front, again, in a syllabus or through a first-class conversation, what does it look like to faculty for a student to be engaged? What does it mean to be a good group member? What does a strong discussion question look like? What's a good email look like? What's not a good email, right? What kinds of emails annoy you? And help students recognize that if they have a script for what they did with one professor and it worked, it doesn't mean it's going to work the same with you. That part of navigating social relationships is kind of navigating some of those shifting expectations. Those are skills that are particularly difficult with some students who are not neurotypical, but it doesn't mean that they are not able to do those things. They just need a little bit of guidance. Okay. So one way to do this is to develop group or class norms, okay, and then post those on your learning management system. You need to articulate your own limits to yourself too. So you need to know what are the things that irritate you and try to engage in some preventative measures to shut those down on the front end. Figure out who that colleague is. So if you need to consult, who is the person who's going to both give you support and help you think things through? You can ask for that, and some people are still better at it than others. Okay, and there may be other things that you can do too that I haven't thought about here. So Finally, the last sort of thing I want to say here is that these steps all came from different parts of research related to kind of emotion as well as psychotherapy. So identifying specific behaviors has principles of mindfulness. So in mindfulness, we want to articulate our thoughts without judgment. So that allows people to take a little bit of space rather than the judgments influencing other feelings and actions. We can kind of take some space to articulate them. Identifying the repercussions of the behaviors allows for self-reflection, expansion, meaning, which is important. Brainstorming potential underlying explanations, as I said earlier, uses principles of cognitive reappraisal to try to get perspective and help recognize that your initial judgment of what might be going on might not be true. It might give you a little more compassion for what's going on for the student. Document, because memory is fallible. Consult, because we tend to look at things from our own lens, and getting an outside perspective can help you realize what you're missing. That's especially useful if you can come at this from a lens of curiosity. And then taking action provides some, use of communication skills, using I statements, using that specificity that you came up with before, and an attitude of compassion and curiosity and non-judgment goes a long way to getting students to soften and helping motivate them to engage in behaviors that are in line with your expectations.
Thank you so much. Like, I'm going to applaud like this. Thank you so much, Jen. Yeah, I think I reflected quite a lot during your talk. So thank you so much. Are there any questions from the audience? And we have a couple of minutes left for any questions. Anything at all that comes to mind? I can. Oh, we have a couple. So let me see. Lance, you raised your hand.
This is maybe a very detailed question. I was curious when you mentioned, by the way, I enjoyed your talk immensely, but my curiosity was particularly sparked when you said that you like the students, I think, to address you as professor. I may have got that wrong, and I was just interested whether that's in your opinion alters the dynamic between you and the students in a particular way that you think is to your advantage. Sorry, that's a very garbled, long-winded question, but it's come up in another context for me.
So I think for me, it is because in the US, in the South, students are taught to say Mrs. as a form of respect, and like that, men don't get it the same way. So it's a real gendered response that irks me. Because it devalues my education and experience that by calling me Mrs. instead of professor or doctor. I don't feel like I need that level of expertise to be able to give feedback to students. I actually think that trying to understand students and kind of shift and actually decrease the power dynamic helps the students being able to talk and be more honest. But for me, it's about kind of recognizing that when you're in a professional setting, you need to call people by their professional titles. And it doesn't mean that, we can't have a real kind of conversation. So I'm intentionally casual with my students. I make all kinds of pop culture references. I swear on purpose. I have them comment on my clothes because I want them to be able to talk to me as a person, but I also want them to show respect for the title.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you so much. Julie.
Hi, Jen. Really interesting talk. I was thinking, is it possible that sometimes you cannot solve, the problem? I'm thinking about a student who wasn't engaging with the work, and basically they were saying that, well, it's my fault, the teacher's fault. So despite evidence, everything was documented, etc. the student ended up being transferred to another teacher, and that teacher had exactly the same problem behavioral. So in my opinion, it's because that student lacked completely of insight. You know, she wasn't able to realize what was going on with her. So how do you deal with students like that?
So here's where my therapy training can come in handy, right? Because having people talk through like, okay, I get very specific. So talking about if they're unable to meet the expectations, like, how do you know where the expectations are? Are they written down? Asking, you kind of have to trap the student into saying that they never actually looked at the syllabus or that they weren't coming to class, because students are posturing, right? When that's happening, they might lack insight, or it is because they have some insight, but it is too uncomfortable for them to look at. And so being, recognizing our own humanity and being like, look, class is hard, stuff is hard. Sometimes we don't want to do it. And when people don't want to do things, they pull away. It's like, has that ever happened to you? It sure happened to me. And then I can provide an example, because students sometimes just need to know that they're allowed to talk about some of the things that are inside that might not seem so like okay on the outside. I don't know if that entirely answered your question. It's hard without like parameters.
No,
but
I had these discussions with that student, but they really didn't engage at all. It wasn't their fault at all. And so it was really a wall. And
yeah,
I'm still not sure how to get through this type of behavior.
Well, to some extent, right, we talk about this in therapy as well. When you are working so much harder than the student, like, it's not a good use of everybody's energy. So there, it's about like, look, it's being very clear. Here's the expectation. Here's the expectation. You're down here. You're not meeting it, period. And if you've tried to kind of approach the student, understand them, and they're not getting there, then it is about repeat. There's a strategy in dialectical behavior therapy called broken record, where you just repeat the same thing over and over again, and like pull back because the student is not getting anything. And therefore you need to stop putting your time and energy into it when you've shown that it is not working, because it's too stressful and the student's not getting anything anyway. So just be crystal clear and then find something else to think about. And look up the strategy. It's a really good one.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Julie, for the question. I have a question in the chat from Dr. Megha Agrawal. Do you want to ask on camera, or do you want me to read it out? I wasn't sure. I'm also happy to read it out. So yeah, right. So the question is, I would like to know a bit more about slow learners. Could you please elaborate on it?
I guess I'm a little unclear. So slow learners meaning kind of people just who kind of need extra time, or kind of have a hard time ingesting the material as quickly as everybody else. So they're kind of just slow to pick things up. Is that what that means? Yeah, okay. My sense is that slow learning is a learning style. So for someone who's a slow learner, that is the kind of person to recommend to the campus kind of disability office, because slow learning, like, some people just learn slower, some people read slower, some people think slower. And so those are students who I think need accommodations of extra time, or they need to be able to have lectures recorded that they can go back and revisit, because they need to think things through. I don't think there's inherently anything wrong with a slow learner, but students need to know how to identify themselves, that they need a little bit more time and processing, and then adapt themselves accordingly. And as best we can as faculty, we can adapt to them. But this is where accommodations from at the level of the university can come in handy, because I know I don't want to, I don't know how to adapt my expectations for all students of different abilities and styles, that is what the disability office is there for, to tell me what it is that that student needs to be successful.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. I think we also have a lot of provision at our university here at University of Glasgow for people, students with disabilities. The disability services is brilliant. They're really knowledgeable, and they're able to put in quite a lot tailored support as well, which is quite nice. I think I have one final question that has been kind of on my mind while I was listening to you. Here at Uni Glasgow, specifically in psychology, we deal with very big cohorts. So our level 1, so year 1 cohort is 700 students. Our level 2 is 350 students. So when we have and we notice issues with behaviors, it's usually under the cover of anonymity. So you can't really identify who said something, let's say, offensive during the lecture, or who behaved in a way offensively during the lecture, because you can't really, you don't know who it was, you can't identify them. So I was wondering, with the 6 steps, I was thinking about that situation, and then thinking about how to solve it in the end, right? So if you went through all the steps, which is quite nice, it works also for larger cohorts, but at some point when it's about the resolution of it, how does it scale to those very large anonymous classes?
That's a great question. And I don't teach 700-person classes, so I haven't thought about this as much, but just off the top of my head, I think it's in those big classes where I think the group norms piece is particularly important on the front end. And that is, it isn't really about having students police each other, because it's not about, you're not wanting students to like tell on each other, but you are wanting students to be empowered to kind of correct behavior when they see it in the big lecture halls with other students. Because if it's anonymous and like you hear it, the person sitting, someone knows who said it. And so how do you teach people, like in general, that's the kind of instance where I would stop and say, look, I don't know who said this, but I heard this thing, like, we're not going to talk that way. So like, if you hear something like that, give students some phrases of things that they can say to the perpetrator that will help correct the situation. And, if it does become a big enough problem, if you set yourself up as someone who is trustworthy, sometimes students will come kind of tell you, like, this is a person, they keep doing this thing, like, I can't handle it on my own, and they will come to you for help, and then you'll find out who it is.
Yeah, I think that's one step. It's just it's such a difficult situation, because while I think that what you say with the group norms, and to have that kind of established, rules and values that everyone subscribes to, and then some people are trying to kind of help the entire community out by, identifying people, and so that you can talk to people. At the same time, I really feel for those, because they are there to learn, right? So they are there because they're really motivated to learn, and then they have to do this additional task kind of thing. But yeah, no, thanks. That's helpful. All right. If there aren't any other questions, if there are, you can still message us later on, and I can post the question to Jen. I would like to thank Jen for this very inspiring and thought-provoking talk. There are many very concrete steps we can do. Self-reflection as well, which is quite helpful for someone, things you maybe, when you're very stressed, you keep doing the same thing, the same routines, which are not maybe helpful, to maybe take a step back and think about that in a way as well, of own behavior. But overall, thank you so much. And we will have this recording up on our Tile Network website, and the next talk will be on the 12th of March. Thank you.
Thank you.